We're going to start. I'm going to read the first couple verses here right away, and then it just kind of sets the table about what we're looking at. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And along with some of the articles from the temple of God, these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God." Okay, a couple of quick things. Number one, his God, you've probably heard this God's name. His name was Marduk. He was like the patron god of Babylon. And as I was saying to Lauren earlier this morning, I remember going through the Bible, and we hear all these different names referring to this particular region. And Babylon, it's funny because we refer to it as Babylon here. We tend to remember that region and that area in modern-day Iraq as the old Babylonian Empire. But really, what started off as ancient Sumeria, which is where Abram was from, by the way. If you remember, Abram came from the city of Ur, which was in the nation of Sumeria at that time. He left there, and the capital back in those days, if you remember, was a little place in the book of Jonah that Jonah calls out called Nineveh. Right? Nineveh was at one point the capital of this region. Eventually, Babylon expands under. I'm going to say it again, Lauren. I was telling Lauren the story. There's the god. It's the Babylonian king that's in the book of Isaiah. Sennacherib, I think is what his name is. And I always remember because I had a friend who told me it's snack on a rib, and so I always that always stuck with me. So, but I think it's Sennacherib. He ends up expanding the Babylonian Empire to its greatest lengths, and that is when the city of Babylon suddenly becomes one of the big, more important cities. And I think he was the son of Akkad, if you've ever heard of Akkad. Akkad is one of probably the most famous kings of Babylon. And so under all this, suddenly it finally expands. It makes it all the way to Israel, if you remember, because at that point the kingdom of Israel is split into Israel and Judah. They conquer the kingdom of Israel. But Babylon is kind of in a weak state. Things aren't going very well. And so this new king, King Nebuchadnezzar, he shows up. He's actually Nebuchadnezzar the second. He's the second Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And he goes, you know what? Things aren't going well for the empire. Things are doing bad. We need like an easy victory. And so they set their eyes on Judah. Remember, Judah is a postage stamp of a place compared to all the other empire, like all the other places around it. To the east, they have India and China. To the north, and also Persia. And Persia's actually now started to expand around them. And to the west, they have Egypt. And so they have all these great adversaries and kind of allies in the area. And so Nebuchadnezzar's looking for an easy victory. So he says, "Aha! I will conquer you and your God, Judah." Because remember, in pagan society, when people went to war, you didn't just go to war, your gods went to war. Right? We saw this all the way back when we were reading the book of 1 Samuel, when the Philistines come and attack and sack Judah. They steal the Ark of the Covenant, and of course, God wasn't going to allow that. And so even though God's Ark was taken, God has his judgment on the Philistines. And so we see here, it says, articles from the temple of God were once again carried off to be with the god of Babylonia, to be with Marduk. And so this is of course common practice, but it doesn't stop there. In verse 3, we also read, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility," right? So upper class Israelites. "Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, so the best of the best. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel he called Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, This was, of course, quite common back in the day. It's funny because we actually get really upset about this type of behavior today. In fact, even when we look back at it in history, we're like, oh, how horribly barbaric. But this activity, what's going on right here, is this was a tried, tested, and true way of assimilating a new culture, a new group of people into your empire. What they did is they took your upper class, the upper echelon of your empire, they brought them in, taught them, schooled them, made them a part of your people, so in that way the people that belonged to their people would also be influenced, and it would overall change the entire culture. So this is, of course, extremely, extremely common, especially in ancient times. And you can look at it throughout all of history. Whenever Rome went from place to place, Rome did the exact same thing. Greece did or Macedonia did the exact same thing under Alexander the Great. And of course, we see that in the British Empire later. We see it in the Ottoman Empire, where constantly, whenever you would conquer, you would bring people in, you would train up their people, so in that way it would help influence and change the culture that they were from. However, I think they really underestimated what was going on. It says here in verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men? At your age, the king would then have my head because of you. So why would Daniel not, like, what about the food do you think would defile himself? What would be so upsetting? What's that? Yes, absolutely. That's definitely one of the things that we don't think about, because we go to the supermarket to buy our meat, or if you're real up there, you go to a butcher to buy your meat, right? But what we don't realize is that the butcher, the supermarket of that day, for everyone, including the Jews, remember, even the Jews partook of this practice, you ate the meat that was sacrificed to God, right? If you were Jewish, of course, you would go and you would sacrifice at the temple, you would sacrifice a part of it, and then you would eat the sacrifice. Remember, there was, of course, whole burnt sacrifices. Those ones, obviously, we didn't eat, but that was a bulk of how people got their food. In pagan cultures, you were constantly sacrificing meat to idols. And this, of course, becomes a really big deal. The other thing, of course, is that Jews have food laws, right? They got to keep kosher. They have very specific rules, and the meat has to be killed in a certain way, and it has to be done. So he's like, look, I've been raised a Jew since birth. He's a young man, so we figure he's probably either late teens or early 20s. He's been raised since the time he was a child, that this is how he ought to behave, and this is who God wants him to be, and this is what God has set out before him. And he's like, I will not, and I love that he says this, defile myself. Right? It's not just that we read here at the top in verse 8, where he says he resolved not to. He says he actually went to the official and asked for permission not to defile himself, not to wrong himself, pollute himself, make himself worse. And of course, and you know, if anyone's listening to this and going, see, he didn't want to eat the meat. Vegan's good. That's not what's going on here. Let's face it. The official here has a very real, fear. First off, if Daniel starts looking sickly, it's on him. He's the one that's in charge of taking care of him, making sure that he's healthy, making sure that he's well schooled, making sure that things are going well. And let's also remember, people, maybe you can eat vegan today, and maybe you can be healthy if you stick to a very particular diet, make sure you vary your appetite, make sure you get the right types of proteins and stuff like this. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with over 2,000 years ago, okay? This is about 500, I think it's 500 BC. So we're doing 2,500 years ago. Do you really think they could just go down to the supermarket and go get some quinoa and some avocado? No, that didn't exist. You're gonna have a very, very bad diet if all you're having is vegetables and water. but it's also part of the miracle about what's happening here. See, in verse 11 it says, Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of those 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Why do I point this out? This isn't to say that a vegetarian diet is better or a vegan diet is better. It's to point out that even under such harsh conditions, when we go after the things of God, when we say, God, I've been taken captive, I've been taken to a foreign place, I'm being forced to go through their education, I'm being forced to learn their ways, their practices, their culture. But I'm going to remain true to you in whatever way I can. And if that means my diet, that means my diet. God will honor that. Right? It said God made the official show favor to Daniel. Why? Because of Daniel's faith. Daniel didn't break faith. And then when they were only eating vegetables and water, God kept them nourished. God provided that miracle. Because again, the vegetables, the variety of vegetables that they had access to in that region, while more than most, because ancient Sumeria was like a huge trade city and it was able to have influence with a lot of the world. We didn't have refrigeration. We didn't have quick transport. So you would have had to eat things that were grown locally. You wouldn't have had much variety, and you wouldn't have had enough different things to nourish you properly without meat. And the fact that these 4 young men suddenly begin to show that they're healthier, doing well, this is a miracle of God. This is God taking care of them, even in their captivity. It says, to these 4 young men, verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding, all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So when they entered the king's service, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is incredible. We see, one of the things that I say to Rebecca all the time, and I'll say this to everybody really, is that we never see an isolated example of a way God does things. We see a pattern of behavior from God all the time. Right? When we see how Daniel is treated here and how Daniel is brought up, remember, what is Daniel? Daniel is a captive. It reminds me a lot of Joseph, when Joseph was a captive and sold as a slave into Egypt. And then he is brought up, he is blessed, he has done well, and the favor of God that rests upon him is evident to those around him, and he rises up through the ranks until eventually Joseph at the right hand of Pharaoh, and then we see Daniel at the most prominent position possible next to Nebuchadnezzar, where he becomes a powerful individual in the service of the king of the empire. See, God doesn't just do things one way, one time. God has a pattern of behavior. See, God blesses those who stay true to him, especially when things are difficult. And what Daniel is doing here in this first chapter, he's setting the table, helping us to understand what was going on. Because what we know about the book of Daniel is Daniel wrote this closer to the end of his life than he obviously did at the beginning. He's recounting back the events and letting us know what happened and what has changed. That's how we know something like the reign of King Cyrus, who, by the way, is Medo-Persian, not Babylonian. But despite everything that's happened, despite being taken captive, despite being removed from his home, despite being forced through this indoctrination, despite being removed from his family, and despite being taken away from the temple of his God, Daniel doesn't break faith. I thought about this as I was preparing this. This has been something I've been hearing from a lot of people lately. And I actually had a really good and productive conversation with someone recently about this, where, and you've probably heard this said, where people will say that I can't get behind the God of the Old Testament because he was so cruel, he was so evil, and he did all these nasty things. Because when we read in the Bible about the king of Babylon coming in to the land of Judah and supplanting it, we read that this was a judgment from God because of the way that the people had behaved, that they no longer worshipped at the temple, but instead went and worshipped the golden calves, and they worshipped Baal, and they worshipped at the Asherah poles. They no longer considered God to be God Most High. And so he handed them over to their desires. And so we'll say, yeah, but how is that any good? He also sacrificed, right? People will say this, they'll say, God also punished all the innocent. All those who still loved him, all the children. Think about it. God, how could such a loving God allow this to happen? So for that, I want to give you an example. Because here's the thing, God is the judge, and God is a good judge. You agree to that? He's a good judge. It means his judgment is true, he holds true to the law, and he does not deviate. Now, if we had a judge sitting in a court here, here in Kobe, I guess in Lindsay, we had a murder trial, and that person was found guilty of murder. Would we go, well, that judge isn't very loving, because that judge doesn't realize he's taking that man away from his wife and children? How are they going to survive? Who's going to provide for the wife and children? What's going to happen? They're going to suffer as a result of the judge's judgment on this man. Right? We wouldn't say that. That sounds ridiculous. We would say, no, it's the responsibility of the person who did the murder. It's the responsibility of the sinner. See, we often do this all the time. We project our guilt onto the Lord. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't God's fault that the nation of Israel fell. He told them, if you want me to be here and for things to go well for you in the land of Israel, here are the criteria. Here is what you must do. And what did they do? They deviated. What did we do? Here in North America, we've been deviating further and further away from the path of God, and you can see that as our culture starts to have more and more problems and more complications and more difficulties, because as we get further and further away from the things of God, then things get a lot more shaky. Right? It's what Jesus talked about when he said, you got to build your house on the rock, not on shifting sand. What are you building your beliefs in? What are you building your foundation in? See, Daniel, as he's looking at this whole situation, as he's going through this, he's not blaming God for the fact that Israel fell. He can look at Israel and say, yes, we were guilty. Yes, they did this. And as a result, other people got hurt. Right? When people get divorced, who is affected the most? The children. Not the two individuals that were married. So what should we say? Should we? How do you deal with that then? Do you criminalize that? You say you can't actually separate? Do you force people to live together? How do you deal with that? Or do you realize that it's about making good decisions first? Right? Because a good judge is going to say, well, no, you violated the law. No, you did this thing. And let's face it, if you have a law, if you have a rule, and you do not enforce the rule, then that rule is in fact null. Right? If we say, you can't kill people, and then someone kills someone, and you say, well, don't do it again, that's not a real penalty. It's not, like, people aren't going to feel like the rule is enforced, so why should I enforce it? See, here's the thing. God being a good judge, being true, and saying, look, this is the established order. This is how things are. If he deviates from that, then we can no longer have faith in him as a good judge. But the fact is that we know we can rely on him, we can rely on his word, and we can hold him true. And that at the end of the day, it is not the judge's fault when others get hurt. It's not the judge's fault. It's not God's fault that Daniel got taken into captivity. It's the people around him and the culture and the society that gave up on God, who allowed themselves to be corrupted and taken over. And you know what? And I believe this to be true for children of divorce as well. I think God loves them ever so much. And God will look out for them. And God loves them. And God will be with them. Because just because some earthly thing happened and things become more difficult doesn't mean that God has abandoned them. See, Daniel knew this. And as he's been taken to this far-off land, and if you've ever taken a look, like, it's a big stretch. It would have taken him probably, maybe a month in journeying just to get to Babylon. It's quite a journey. And then he would have been educated in other ways. He would have been taught new languages. He was taught new ways to dress, new ways to behave, new ways to do this and that. And yet, Daniel never broke faith. Despite his horrible circumstances. Remember, it's not like he went there voluntarily. He's a captive. He's a prisoner. And he's being held against his will. And yet Daniel doesn't say, well, I'm going to get my revenge or I'm going to get my retribution. He says, God, I'm willing to allow you to use me even in my terrible circumstances. God, use me today. See, we need to keep faith when things get hard. Because that's really when faith matters the most. The faith matters the most. See, a lot of times we like to be Christians that have easy faith. When things are good and things are bountiful and plentiful and we have all kinds of freedoms, it's easy to say, we're Christian. But when it gets hard, when we're oppressed, really oppressed, when we're hunted and killed, people are tortured. I brought this up to Rebecca the other day. I said, it's funny because people will say that it's because of Constantine that the Roman Empire fell, and that because he made it a state religion, which he didn't, by the way. All Constantine did is make Christianity not illegal. You have literally the emperor before him was literally rounding people up, throwing them in the Colosseum to be eaten by lions and tigers. And the beautiful thing about that is that they realized, you know what, despite our circumstances, despite how horrible things are, they weren't recanted. They didn't say, they didn't abandon God. They held true to their faith. They held true to who God was, because they realized if I'm going to hold God to his word, if I'm going to say, God, you got to be a person of your word, then I got to be one of mine. This is what Daniel saw. This is what Daniel led to. And this is why, as we get into the book of Daniel, you're going to see it's all about faith. It's all about faith in challenging times. It's all about faith in difficulty. It's all about faith when things are really, really hard. And how important, how vital, and how much that can change the world. So let us endeavor to be those people. People of great faith. Faith when things are difficult. Faith when things are hard. That we remain a grateful, loving, and honest people. And that we would be faithful to our Lord, to our God, who has been so, so good to us.